Okay, folks, we gotta talk about the how and the why of what Jerome Powell just did to sail us into the big Red Sea. And then we need to go through a violent breakdown of this inflation problem. What is causing it, what the potential solutions are, and how this impacts you and your money. And the only thing that I ask before we get into it is that you hit that ravishing like button, and also don't forget to subscribe either. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell indicated Tuesday that the central bank could step up the removal of its efforts to boost the economy as it battles escalating inflationary pressures. The Fed chief said he thinks reducing the pace of monthly bond buys can move more quickly than the $15 billion a month schedule announced earlier this month. At this point, the economy is very strong and inflationary pressures are higher, and it is therefore appropriate, in my view, to consider wrapping up the taper of our asset purchases, which we actually announced at the November meeting, perhaps a few months sooner. Of course, the first stage of tightening monetary policy is first tapering and then later interest rates. So by tapering earlier and more aggressively, the worry is that this could also result in the Fed being able to raise interest rates a lot faster than expected. But importantly, Powell stressed that tapering should not be seen as an indication that rate increases are looming, but it certainly does provide them with more leeway. The other big news item from him is a flip on his infamous use of the word transitory, which of course was a big point of Fed criticism pretty much throughout the year. He said, quote, "The word transitory has different meanings for different people. To many, it carries a sense of short-lived. We tend to use it to mean that it won't leave a permanent mark in the form of higher inflation. I think it's probably a good time to retire that word and try to explain more clearly what we mean." I guess you could say that the Fed's use of the word transitory, at least in and of itself, was, well, transitory. And of course, Powell has always left the door open to tightening monetary policy faster than expected, if need be. However, this was the biggest step that we've seen so far in indicating that this could be a lot faster than expected. And the biggest step that we've seen in terms of admission that inflationary pressures are a lot longer lasting. That said, Business Insider ran a piece this morning that showed Jerome Powell trying to balance the weight of the world in his hands, and the hidden message here is really that there's only so much he controls. The sinister implication behind what happened today with the Fed and their announcement is the Fed basically said, hey, supply chain issues are still the main cause of this, but we're going to do our part to reduce the demand side by, again, tapering our asset purchases and eventual interest rates. But the implication, if the Fed is right, is that the Fed didn't cause the problem, and really, they can only do so much to fix it. Supply chain issues need to go down or the Fed loses control of this inflationary situation. And a lot of Americans right now are pretty damn pissed at losing their buying power, and they should be. Whether you are talking food, energy, or any number of goods and services, you're seeing huge pricing pressures across the board. And I know this is becoming an even more politically and controversial issue heading into the 2022 midterm elections, but when I research an issue, I like to set all the noise aside and write down what I believe are the causes, my analysis on the causes, and the potential solutions. So the problem we have right now is that rising prices are eroding American consumers' spending power much faster than wages are increasing overall. There's definitely some industries where wages have increased faster than prices, but overall, you're seeing that prices are increasing faster than wages. Of course, it especially squeezes middle-class Americans, right? Because people who spend all of their money on day-to-day items and live more paycheck to paycheck, these are the people that are going to be more adversely affected by rising prices. Of course, it also negatively impacts savers because their dollars are worth less. When you squeeze the consumers, what happens? Well, you also squeeze a lot of the discretionary companies because these consumers no longer have money to spend on said discretionary goods and services. So what are some of the main causes of this issue? Well, I listed them. They're not in any sort of order, but let's go through the list. So number one is monetary policy over at, well, the Fed. Lower interest rates have made it easier to buy up asset classes, adding a gigantic pump to said asset prices, real estate stocks, and so forth. You're paying more for most assets now than you have at any time in history. You're paying more for companies that are giving you less. You're paying more for real estate that is the same. And overall, especially in the housing market, you're starting to see that impact the actual cost of rentals. So for people who are actually renting, it is increasing that cost of living there from that standpoint as well, which is something we didn't see last year, but we are seeing now. A lot of analysts do like to blame day-to-day living increases in terms of gas or food prices or things that you need in your daily life every single day that you purchase regularly. They like to blame that on the Fed, but those pricing pressures have much more direct causes, and those are from the supply chain side. COVID-induced supply chain issues continue to be rampant, in some cases even even worse than ever. As compared to pre-COVID, the majority of sectors are experiencing some combination of less available parts and materials, less workers, many stubborn general miscellaneous shortages that are too long to list. You also have travel and overall international transportation restrictions, increasing costs and time to transport. You have high oil, gas prices, energy prices. All of these things contribute to high cost to fulfill demand, big bottlenecks, and also create relentless delays for goods and services. It's my opinion that the biggest reason that we're in such a massive storm in terms of pricing pressures is because of this category right now. You're going to see a lot of pricing pressures from all of the other ones as well, but this one in particular is the one that I think is driving most of the pricing pressures that you're seeing right now. And there are things that people can do to mitigate this. Now, consumer spending. Consumer behavior has shifted from service-based spending to good-based spending during the pandemic, contributing to higher demand. During the pandemic, people wanted to buy what? Goods, not experiences, not services. Why? Because people were stuck at home. They didn't want to go out because of the damn virus, so on and so forth. You know the story. Well, consumer behavior has changed since then, but not to the extent that it had been prior to the damn virus. So now we're in the situation where you still have higher than expected demand for goods, and you have massive supply shortages from all the people that wanted goods back when we weren't producing any more goods because manufacturing was shut down. So now you have this trajectory where we have to catch up from all that inventory that we cleaned out last year, and we also have to overproduce for the massive demand for good increase that we have this year. Next, obviously, we have to talk about stimulus, placing money in the hands of consumers and companies at the same time where economic goods were not being produced is a problem. There's obviously a lot of good reasons to pass stimulus, especially if the government shuts everybody down. Regardless of how you feel about it, money is not something that just creates economic value in and of itself. If you create money during a period of time where the economic system that it's attached to isn't providing more economic value, well, eventually down the road you have to pay for that via inflation and loss of purchasing power of said dollars. And it's certainly true that a lot of the ramifications for passing stimulus may not be something that's seen in the short to medium run, but over the long run, you'll definitely see an impact. Now, obviously, my Cathie Wood senses are saying, well, if technology increases productivity to a point where you're actually getting more value per dollar because of technological increases, well, you could see some balancing out of that or even deflation. Hashtag Cathie Wood. But of course, that change doesn't happen overnight. And in the meantime, we're dealing with a lot of these inflationary pressures. Lastly, uncertainty. So companies and to a lesser extent consumers are stockpiling on goods in order to have high inventory just in case there are future supply chain shocks. Now, a lot of companies missed out on great opportunities to sell their goods during the pandemic because they didn't have any damn supply. Many are seeing the situation where we constantly get hit with new variants and new rolling lockdowns across the world, really. And many of them don't want to make the mistake of not being stacked up and prepared if they do have another supply chain crunch where they can't get anything. So what are they doing? Well, they're panic buying and creating supply chain issues by doing so. And that's a mess. And that's another cause of inflationary pressure. And a reason that a lot of people think that we're actually going to see a lot of deflation at the end of this because a lot of people overstacked up on their inventory, which means that there's an overabundance of supply and they're going to have to lower prices in order to offload that supply. Okay, but what about solutions? Well, the nuclear option to reducing inflation is by reducing demand, which of course is done through tapering asset purchases and raising interest rates. You could certainly make a case for modest tightening over the upcoming years in order to curtail some of that excess liquidity, but some people are proposing massive tightening, but solving a supply chain driven inflationary problem by nuking demand isn't the way to go. I hate to use this analogy, but it's sort of like chemotherapy for the economy. You kill some of the healthy economic activity in order to curtail, hopefully, some of the negative economic activity that's resulting in inflation. Some of the other solutions that could help line by line are, well, number one, figuring out how to lower overall energy prices. Easier said than done. There are steps that the government can take that, for the most part, we haven't really seen them do. Reducing renewable standard criteria temporarily, lifting offshore drilling bans, approving pipelines instead of declining them, offloading reserves, dramatically speeding up permits to drill, and reducing sanctions on countries that can add to the global supply. All of these things would increase supply and lower costs. Obviously, there's a political cost to all of these, and some of these are debated on political lines. Of course, some of these would have to happen on a statewide level as well in order to really reduce overall costs. But when it comes to solutions for this problem, I think that you could definitely make a case for reducing the burden imposed by governmental restrictions on these, at least on a temporary basis. You have to start thinking, okay, well, what is the negative impact? And is for this time period, the negative impact outweighing the positive impact for having these restrictions? And then at that point, then you can make a decision. But I feel like people kind of just lock off the conversation because of the politics behind it. Transportation, there are substantial shipping and trucking regulations both within the US and coming into the US. Short-term pausing of some of those measures could go a long way down the supply chain. Obviously, regulations are there for a reason, but there's a lot of red tape that doesn't need to be there on a short-term basis. Also, creating some sort of incentive to logistics companies or trucking and shipping companies to help with certain industries that are seeing the biggest bottlenecks in transportation and demand. Next is limiting spending. Obviously, this one is a bit more controversial, and I'm not suggesting that we do or don't do this. That's up to you, my friends. But a possible solution is to be, well, more strategic to limiting spending. If you want to solve an inflationary pressure, you have to figure out the source of that inflationary pressure, and spending is a big part of that, and a lot of spending comes from, well, the federal government and state governments. We can't undo what we already spent, and much was arguably necessary, but as the economy grows and expands, consumers, companies, and industries are a lot more able to fend for themselves than they were when the government forced them to shut down. Obviously, there's a lot of Americans who are struggling to bounce back from this pandemic, but a lot of those Americans are struggling just as much with inflationary pressures. So a lot of these proposals, if overdone, may actually be a net loss. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. Obviously, it depends on the bigger picture. There's a lot of factors here, but just something to think about. Outside of government, there's also consumer behavior shifts that need to take place. I don't know how you get this one to happen, but consumers need to again shift away from goods and back to experiences and services. I don't know how this happens, probably time and distance away from the pandemic, but this is a big impact. If you want to get rid of demand naturally, you have to spread out said demand, and that has to happen on the consumer level. And I think that comes with consumer confidence and consumers being less scared of variance. The other one is to stop price gouging or discourage it from ever happening. There are a lot of industries that are hiking prices across the board because of higher costs to operate and get goods and services to customers. But some of them, even when their input costs go down, they still don't lower their cost to consumers. And a lot of these industries aren't perfect markets where they have perfect competition where your competitor could just undercut you. There's a lot of industries out there where you can change the product that you're offering, raise the price, offer less product, and consumers won't notice. And it's very difficult to undercut that. And that kind of brings me to the next point, which is a lot of these problems can be solved by working with companies. Companies are the ones that are passing on prices to consumers that are being passed on to them, which are being passed on to whoever's fulfilling supply, and is just circulating all around the economy and causing this mess. But if you solve some of these issues by working with companies on a company level, you could figure out how to make companies work a little bit more efficiently, incentivize companies with, say, tax credits, regulatory incentives, incentives for workers to work in industries with labor shortages. And incentives don't have to be tax credits. They could be, oh, you got a permit for this project that you're doing or an exception to this regulation that we have imposed on your company in years past. There certainly could be some specific incentives for companies that can help lower the supply chain issues and the inflationary pressures. Also, there's certainly an argument to be made about temporarily lifting tariffs on imported goods, specifically bad in steel and aluminum, which the US has substantial tariffs on and hurts a lot of manufacturers here and consumers. Obviously, politically tense issues, and there's reasons that tariffs are in place in the first place, but if you are going to look for solutions, this is yet another solution. But obviously, the most effective solution over the long run is giving it time. International rolling lockdowns, variant outbreaks, and global issues to the supply chain aren't going to go away for a while. In fact, these variants are probably going to come around for quite some time, if not forever, and people just stop caring. I think the process right now is how do you manage the pain in the short term in order to promote strong resiliency over the long term. And everybody has a different opinion on that. Hopefully this got you thinking about what is and isn't possible. I think that overall you should see some more strategic government action taking. You do need to see some working with companies on the supply chain. You do need to see maybe some modest, very modest tightening of monetary policy. And overall, you need some time and patience. Anyways, folks, that caps off the video. Let me know what you think down below. If you want to sign up for ZipTrader U, we do still have our Black Friday 100 coupon code active, so make sure to check that out. If you're wondering what broker to trade these stocks and cryptos on, well, I'll put a link down below to Webull, and you will get 2 free stocks when you sign up and deposit with said link. They do offer the SHIB, so if you do want to trade the SHIB on Webull, you can. Have a good one, and I'll see you in the next video.